Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Yeshua Moser-Pung Suan. I'm a board member with Nonviolence International Canada, and I'm speaking to you from the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen and Wisanic nations. Welcome to this briefing of a report by Nonviolence International titled In Search of Enemies, which focuses on excessive military expenditures by a small group of states who endanger us all. We have all seen figures regarding global military expenditures of over $1 trillion, which is a figure so vast that none of us can really conceptualize it in a meaningful way. It is an amount so overwhelming that many of us may feel absolutely disempowered by it. Over the past decade, 15 times that, over 15 trillion in military expenditures were spent. Our goal in this research was to try and make some sense of it. First of all, it is not global military expenditures. In looking at military expenditures over the past decade, we found that only 15% of UN member states accounted for some 90% of that figure. Put in another way, 85% of UN member states don't play this game. 10% don't play it at all. They don't even have a military. Over the past decade, although we have spent a vast amount of the public purse on the military, no one I know feels vastly more safe, just the opposite. Yet, it is the element of defense, always undefined, which is publicly claimed to be the reason for the vast sums needed to be spent. To examine this further, we looked into military white papers which outline threat perceptions which supposedly justify these expenditures. We then looked at how these states approach humanitarian or people-centered approaches to disarmament. In a moment, we will be led through the report. However, if questions occur during the presentation period, write them into the chat window and we will answer them at the end. This report was compiled by 3 remarkable young women. Abby Kramer, who launched the research, Elizabeth Curley, who carried the research through midstream, and Roisin Putti, who led the final report compilation and developed the humanitarian disarmament scale used within the report. I'd like to now invite Ms. Roisin Putti to take us through the report. Roisin, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Yeshua, and good afternoon, everyone. This report has been many months in the making at this stage, and those of us who are involved in the research feel that it has an important contribution to make to discourses around disarmament by highlighting how high and unconstrained military spending is itself a threat to humanity. Much of our work follows from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs and its occasional papers on military spending, which was released last April. States themselves have also begun to address the issue of high military spending at fora such as the First Committee. We hope that by outlining who the most militarized states are, how much they spend, their assessment of risk, and their record on other issues of humanitarian disarmament, we can continue to exert pressure and put this issue on the humanitarian disarmament agenda. So alongside this agenda setting aim, there are also a number of other aims. We're hoping that this resource can hold bad actors accountable in the area of military spending. We will try to achieve this by publishing the name of the 30 most militarized states in the world, along with the amount they spent on the military in US dollars between 2010 and 2019. The report also tries to step into the shoes of these states by looking at official government documentation on military spending and the threats identified in these documents. We have used commitment to humanitarian disarmament as a mode of comparison. We have assessed states' participation in international treaties which promote humanitarian disarmament, and we use this data to make connections and observations later on. Finally, the last section of this report is dedicated to making recommendations, generally addressed to the governments of the 30 states, which are the subject of this report. So who are the key actors in this area? I've included here on this slide the 30 most militarized states between 2010 and 2019, as well as the amount each state spent in that time. Obviously, there's a lot of data here to digest at once, but all of these figures are, of course, in the published report, which will be available on the Nonviolence International Canada website. The US, as you can see, ranks number 1, having spent 6.5 trillion between 2010 and 2019. China has also almost spent 2 trillion. In total, these states spent 15.6 trillion on weapons and militaries in the last decade. And as this is something that can be quite difficult to quantify and contextualize, I'm bringing some UNODA statistics in here. This year, in their occasional paper, in response to global military spending of 1.9 trillion in 2019, UNODA calculated that just 3% of global military spending would achieve quality primary and secondary education for all. 5% would be more than enough to pay for the initial costs of adapting to climate change in developing countries. And 13% of global military budget would eliminate extreme poverty and hunger. Against this factual backdrop, the statistics and the figures that you're seeing here on the screen become very difficult to justify. The next part of our research involved looking at primary data to get a sense of what highly militarized states perceive as threats. In other words, what is motivating this high and unconstrained military spending? Military white papers and other primary data was available for 24 of the 30 states. While navigating these papers and policy documents, certain similarities emerged in the threats being asserted, and they are cited here on the screen. So as we can see, all 24 states refer to terrorism. 21 states refer to nuclear weapons, 18 mention crime, and 17 mention the environment. 15 countries cited conventional military threats, which we took to mean arming to repel invasion by a neighboring state. 14 looked to the acquisition of weapons in other countries as motivation for military spending. On the lower end of the spectrum, 13 states mentioned threats related to public health, 12 refer to informal migration, 10 refer to economy, and 7 detailed technology and military advances. These 10 categories are the purported reasons why states spend billions and millions on US dollars on their national militaries each year. We see a wide range of conventional and unconventional threats listed, and we also have a brief synopsis of the 24 white papers that were analysed, which is in the report. Next, the report seeks to get a sense of how these countries behave in the area of humanitarian disarmament more broadly. We rely on the humanitarian disarmament movement as a model for progressive behaviour in the area of disarmament. As I'm sure many are aware, humanitarian disarmament is a people-centred approach that conceptualizes disarmament as something that's important, not just from the point of view of international security, but as a reflection of the immeasurable damage that armed conflict has caused to society. To gauge a state's commitment to the principles of humanitarian disarmament, we look at whether the 30 states have signed and ratified key disarmament treaties, or called for the creation of new treaties that will achieve humanitarian disarmament aims. As you can see, the scale goes from 0 to 10, and it should be noted also that protection of the environment during conflict is a key element of humanitarian disarmament. However, we don't feel at present that there is an appropriate way to measure this commitment by states. The next slide shows the results, color-coded in what's hopefully a fairly intuitive way. So you can see that the red countries exhibit low commitment to humanitarian disarmament, ranking from between 0 and 3 points. The yellow countries have medium levels of commitment, between 4 and 7 points. And one country, Mexico, achieved a high level of commitment to humanitarian disarmament. Mexico scored 10 points. So I'm just going to pause for a second so that you can look at the statistics on the screen, but obviously bear in mind that these are in the published document as well. So comparing states' investment in national militaries to their commitment to humanitarian disarmament, there is a relationship. And while it's not perfectly proportional, there's definitely some significance. The most militarized states are among the least committed to humanitarian disarmament. The US and China score 1 and 3 respectively on the humanitarian disarmament scale. On the other hand, Mexico is the 29th most militarized state. So in the context of these 30 states, one of the least militarized, and it has a score of 10. Looking at the spending figures, the white papers and the humanitarian disarmament scale cumulatively, the researchers have derived 3 observations, and you can see them on the screen here. First of all, states clearly prioritize military expenditure over humanitarian disarmament. We can divide, within this observation, we can divide behavior into 2 categories. We have non-engagement states that are generally the highest spenders and the least invested in humanitarian disarmament. They use state-centric language in their official documentation and tend to refer to more traditional threats. The other type of state behavior we've termed rhetorical multilateralism. And these are states that are reasonably strong advocates for disarmament at international fora, but this isn't reflected in their attitude and affairs at home. They have reasonably high humanitarian disarmament scores, but equally, they have high enough military spending to justify their inclusion in this report. They're more likely to refer to transnational and international concepts in government data, and also to list non-traditional and newer security threats. More on these behaviors and the implications and conclusions we've drawn about these behaviors is in section 3 of the observations. So I would encourage anyone to read the report who's interested in this. But I'll move on to observation number 2 now, which is that states try to justify spending by referring to threats that are not easily solved by military means. States refer to terrorism, crime, the environment, public health, migration, and economy as threats in white papers. But thinking more deeply about these 6 issues, you might find that military solutions aren't the first thing to spring to mind. To give one example, it's difficult to see how concerns about the environment and climate change should trigger high military spending when armed conflict and weapons are themselves so environmentally damaging. And as I mentioned earlier, just 5% of the 2019 global military budget would put the initial infrastructure in place so that developing countries could adapt to climate change. But instead, this money is being used in ways that are actually environmentally destructive and damaging. Similar arguments can be made in relation to the other threats. And if this is something that interests you, again, I would encourage you to read section 3 of the report. The final observation draws again on the UNODA paper, which found that unconstrained military spending makes the world less safe. We, the researchers of the report, argue that states who increase their military spending because they see others doing so, and states who accumulate weapons to prepare for the invasion by another country, engage in cycles of insecurity and spur mistrust between states. A similar argument can be made and is made in the report about technological and intelligence advances. We've tried to be as specific as possible in identifying steps that states can take to reduce their commitment to unrestricted military investment and for them to join the humanitarian disarmament movement in a meaningful rather than superficial way. In a sentence, what we are seeking for is for states to urgently reconsider the proportion of state funding which is spent on military and divert funding to meet human needs through multilateral cooperative frameworks. In many cases, this can be done through international treaties and other multilateral means. As well as divesting from the military, states need to invest in peace. And we suggest that states develop a cross-cutting Ministry of Peace and Human Security to address peace deficits in society. There are also some more specific and threat-by-threat solutions in the report. But that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to hearing any questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Roisin, for that comprehensive overview of the report. Before I turn to any questions our viewers might have, I'd like to introduce Ms. Maya Garcia, an intern at Nonviolence International's New York office, to provide us for a summary of how excess military spending is commented on by some states that are not subject to this report. Maya, you have the screen.
Thank you. So I will share. This is some data that I collected from 2019 and 2020 first committee statements that were being made. So the 2020 United Nations General Assembly First Committee General Debate concluded on October 19, 2020. Throughout the general debate, some states continue to express their dismay that excess military spending presents an obstacle to global peace and security and international development. This year, the length of the general debate was reduced due to the limitations that imposed by the pandemic. The number of statements were far less during First Committee in 2020, accounting to only about a quarter of the number of statements made by states in 2019. While statements of concern over excessive military spending are made each year at the First Committee, we would like to note the following regarding the past 2 years. In 2019, statements regarding military spending were nearly equally split between two areas of concern. The first was states which drew attention to the $1.8 trillion in military expenditures that could have instead been allocated to sustainable development programs in those nations. The second were states which voiced concerns about military expenditures on nuclear weapons by the nuclear weapon states and the increasing insecurity that caused a few states which stated their concerns over military spending, but did not link the concerns to either sustainable development or nuclear weapons. However, in the 2020 general debate, there was a notable shift toward unanimity for concern and calls for states to reallocate military spending towards sustainable development. Possibly due to the effects of the global pandemic, several statements drew attention to how excessive military expenditures on the military could have better served the international community during a pandemic. Nepal exemplified statements of this type, stating that if, and I quote, a fraction of those resources, if spent in development activities, could bring respite to the millions of people suffering from poverty and hunger. Countries with the highest military expenditures must commit to transfer a certain proportion of their military expenditure to the poor and needy countries grappling with the current pandemic. Nepal believes that the resources spent on the accumulation of armament and their modernization should be diverted to achieving sustainable developments, the sustainable development goals, including health facilities by increasing access to freely available vaccines and treatment. We must realize that human security and survival is more important than anything, end quote. While the increase in military spending is primarily occurring among a few powerful countries, as is revealed in today's report by Nonviolence International, there continues to be a need for the rest of the international community to call out and stigmatize those highly militarized states and demand they reallocate their military expenditures to human well-being, sustainable development, and resolution of humanity's shared by common problems through multilateral cooperation. So I will leave this up for a few more seconds to go over and assess the differences between 2019 and 2020, as we can see. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maya. I'd like to point out that our report identified and called out 30 highly militarized states, both through their excessive expenditures beyond any clear need, and by their non-participation in humanitarian disarmament. They are blocking global disarmament efforts from coming to completion. They're holding disarmament hostage and they must be stigmatized for this. For those states, the momentum of ever-increasing arms procurement has acquired its own logic. They are addicted to militarism. The first step out of addiction is to recognize the addiction. They will need all our help in coming to that recognition. As this is the end of this presentation, I'd like to express our appreciation to our three researchers again, Abigail Kramer, Elizabeth Curley, and Ms. Roisin Putti. I'd also like to thank Ms. Maya Garcia and another volunteer intern at Nonviolence International, Veronica Litmanova, for monitoring First Committee statements for us. And our Zoom coordinator today, Woojin Shin of Nonviolence International in Washington, D.C. Thank all of you for watching wherever you are. Goodbye for now.